Uhlmann, and I am your host for Inside the Creator's Mind, brought to you by Web Series Canada. Today we have a wonderful guest, Davin Lengyel. He is a co-producer, co-creator, co-writer, director of the award-winning web series Deep Six. Davin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and welcome inside my mind.
So let's get right into Deep Six. We had chatted a little bit before about difficulties when it comes to creating content, especially web content when we're working with smaller budgets. Just off the top of your head, what was one of the first challenges that you encountered when starting this project?
Right. And thank you for inviting me here. As we were talking about what project that we thought made the most amount of sense to chat about, Deep Six is the one that bubbled to the top. And the reason is not because of its successes, and it's had some, but mostly because of the difficulties that we had, which were many. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it because, the type of shows that people will have seen and the type of shows that, someone might feature or would make it into TL Webfest are the ones where they came out and they were a success and they launched and people have seen them and they're receiving critical acclaim. And this one had some of that, but I mean behind the scenes it was the most difficult project that I've been on by several magnitudes. So in terms of something that was difficult, I mean I think I'll start with the ambition of the show. So it was a higher budget than I've typically had for a web series, and I've done a number of them. I've probably done about a dozen, and this was on the higher end. And we had kind of this dream that we were getting really good at making this level of web series content. And by good, I'm talking about the producer side of it. So we knew where we could save money. We knew where money was going to show up best on screen. And so we didn't leave ourselves a whole lot of safety room. We really pushed it. We pushed the budget as far as we could possibly go. And it was a relatively big budget.
And
So,
just for our viewers who are
mhm,
hopefully, emerging creatives, I mean, obviously, in terms of budget
right,
level, we don't need to know your exact numbers, but web series are anywhere from kind of no budget,
right.
run and gun to I made one around the $200,000 mark.
Yeah.
And what would you say the range is, the upper range?
Well, so I'm actually happy to talk numbers. I'll tell you exactly what we had.
Oh,
I've
amazing.
worked on web series that were, $200 an episode. I've worked on TV shows that were millions. This one was $440,000 in total.
Okay.
So if you don't quite have a sense of where that stacks up, it's on the high end of indie web series production in Canada, yet still below anything that's Netflix and far below anything that's television. But if you're going to compare 10 indie web series, it's going to be number one or number two in terms of budget level. So high budget. Um, and honestly, when you have a budget like that, and a regular producer would tend to try and find something like 10%, 20% in a contingency fund somewhere to kind of deal with, things that come up during production. Well, we thought we were so clever that let's knock that down to about 2% and let's
Oh
rock
my
and roll. And let's just shoot every dollar that we get and put it on screen. Uh, and we lost that contingency, before we'd even stopped writing. We just, we were really right on the razor's edge.
So
And
what would you say was the first surprise expense for you?
this is one of the things that we did, and this is my first. I think this is going to be a string of tales of caution, and hopefully at the end, maybe I'll circle back and just remind everyone that my crew was incredible, and that all of these failures were failures right at the top on my own shoulders. There was a scope creep, and let me explain what that is. When I talk about web series with creators, I really encourage them to step back and think, are you trying to make what I call a baby TV show, or are you making a web series? Now, what is the difference between the two? It turns out, I think most people actually aren't aware that what they're trying to make is a baby TV show. They're trying to make something that looks like TV. So you squint your eyes, the sets look like a TV set. It has character arcs that follow, a traditional television narrative, has cliffhangers, has setups, has A, B, and C plot structures, has all of the trappings, as wonderful as they are, of a television show. But what they're not doing are the types of things that could never make it to TV. They're not being experimental. I think the example I give just to illustrate is, most people, when they're thinking about making a web series in Canada, they're not thinking about just pointing their camera at 2 feet and having a conversation from left foot to right foot and call that your web series. Why? Because everyone wants to have a career in television. And if you release content like that, people may not take you seriously as a potential television creator. So we make baby TV shows. We make things that look like TV shows but have a smaller budget. The original idea of Deep Six was to ignore that and say, I want to do something that's a little more experimental, a little more out of the box. It's gonna be 3 cockpits of spaceships in space, and it's gonna be mundane conversations between people in a space war. That was what we wrote, on the wall is what we were going to try and do. It was inspired by some scenes in Battlestar Galactica that had just people in cockpits. We knew we could build it. We knew with the budget we had, we could crush that. We could have 30, 40 days of filming because it wouldn't cost very much to build the sets. But then when we got in the writer's room, and this is where we made the first mistake, is we looked at each other in the eye, and I co-wrote this with an amazing writer, Mika Collins, and we said, you know what, let's do a baby TV show. Let's do something that feels more traditional. Let's have a wide cast of characters. Let's have a base. Let's have 7 or 8 locations. And all of a sudden, the scope of the project started to expand into those boundaries of the money that we had. And suddenly, what could have been done with 14 shooting days, but only 3 performers in one set that's reused, became, we might have to shrink this down. Now we're talking 16 days, but we have to build giant sets. We have to build 10 sets. We have to build a life-size spaceship with the exterior. Now we're talking about a cast that has 15 leads and 20 extras, which now in COVID land would be 1 extra. we just, I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. And just like from a producing standpoint, I think I've experienced this as well. As a writer, you want to tell, you just want to tell a good story. But as a producer, you start looking at your budget, and every actor is costing you so much per day in, insurance, clearances, everything just starts adding up. So that's interesting. So it started to it just grew, it took on a life of its own.
It's so hard to look at someone who's given you that amount of money to make a show and not indulge in making good, fulsome characters. And I think that was really hard for us to not follow that path. What I originally had envisioned was something, I won't say fun, but more fun, simpler, a very simple idea. But all of a sudden, with a budget and with talent in the writer's room, and knowing that we're going to have this amazing crew down the road, and that we're starting to see some amazing actors line up, well, let's build some characters. Let's build some story. Let's build some story arcs, and that drove us into a different understanding of the show that we were going to make. Another little thing that I should mention: it's a sci-fi. And not just the sci-fi, like some comedies that I've done in the past. It was like a hard-hitting, realistic, what's called hard science sci-fi. Once you start doing that, the complications rise exponentially. And the way I described it is, if your scene is 2 people sit down and have coffee, well, if you're doing a sci-fi, now you have to think, okay, what are the chairs made of? How did they brew the coffee? Where did they get the coffee beans? What does a coffee cup look like in a space station? Is there 0G? Are they in special suits? Is there a replicator that made this coffee like Star Trek? And then that's a prop in the back. And it seems like the simplest thing in the world is complicated by a factor of 4 once you're doing sci-fi. So
in some ways, it sounds like even, there might be some parallels to producing a period piece where everything has to be, the old cars and all the set pieces add up. It's just the same sort of thing. I mean, I suppose it is a period piece in the future.
Yeah, but no, you're incredibly correct. And in fact, I think period pieces might be slightly harder because you have to try and match something. You have to put a round peg in a round hole. With sci-fi, you get to dream a little bit and kind of make it up, So you have a little bit more leeway, a little more forgiveness in sci-fi.
Absolutely. And just going back a little bit, if you were, this is maybe a big question, you don't have to answer, but if you were doing it again, if you could
Yeah.
go back in time, would you have stayed with that simpler concept, or are you happy that you pushed your boundaries?
Well, it's so tricky to answer that question. I think I think I, I think Mika and myself and the other creatives involved. I hate to speak for them, but I'm guessing we all would have felt shortchanged had we not tried for this more ambitious scope of the project. I would have been stupid to have a writer like Mika on board and not encourage her to take characters and start fleshing them out and building better, fuller, more varied characters. And I think in the end, the project actually, if you ever watch it, if you do watch it, start halfway through. It gets really interesting halfway through. I think the characters that we built they're enticing, they're entrancing, and we may have missed that had we done something more simpler. But it's a little bit of one has to think about what the final strategy is when you're making low budget content because it affects the budget. And I think this might have been where we made a mistake. I think um, uh, what I should have done is still pushed being more experimental in the manner of the camera, if you will. So yes, allow us to write good characters, but figure out ways to shoot this that can pull in some of that scope. You know, I'll tell you a little anecdote. This might not be directly applied to Deep Six, but it's one that I always love. And I think for producers, something that they might want to think about when they're thinking about a difficult or an ambitious project. Um, I was working at Shaftesbury, and I was asked to film a single episode of a idea that had been pitched to us, and the budget was small. I think it was less than $1,000. We didn't have very much. We were testing the waters, and the script that came in from Angelica, she's listening. It was awesome. It was kind of a K-pop drama. It had a few characters. They were kind of they went to someone's mansion and then they went poolside, and I was really struggling on how to produce this thing for only $1,000 to make kind of a pilot to demonstrate the property, and then left Shaftesbury to do actually Deep Six while we were in the middle of figuring this out. And when I saw what the producer did who came on board, which was Stephanie Uhlmann, who worked at Shaftesbury, all the backgrounds were drawn. They were animated. And yes, they had real characters in front and performing, but the backgrounds, they were just pastel drawings, and it was a green screen show. And I had never thought about this. It was just such a brilliant, out of the box way to accomplish the goal on a medium web series where you don't have to think that you're a television series. You can do more experimental, you can do fun things, you can do more artistic things, you can conquer problems in ways that television producers can't because their hands are locked into more traditional shoots.
And isn't it interesting that those things that constrict us, whether it be, usually it is money, like usually it's that our budgets are smaller, but those,
Yeah.
Breed more creativity and to, as you say, think outside the box.
Yeah. And on Deep Six, we were firing with all cylinders when it came to creativity in terms of the shoot. I think some of the lighting effects, the visual effects that we did, just really, really fantastic stuff. But we never applied our creative talents as producers to think about how to conquer that scope creep. And we didn't realize that we were painting ourselves into a corner where, real people, real crew were going to start feeling significant pressures from time scales, from budgets, and from cash flow. Yeah.
So if I'm an emerging, a first-time producer getting my
Hmm.
first grant ever, what is that? What you would say? Keep, simplify it, and then be
Yeah.
creative with your execution.
Well, I have a couple things to say. All of us who make these shows, I'm sure this will resonate with you. We sacrifice to make the best show that we can. I often end up not getting paid for my production work. I often pay into the show. I often donate money because the show needs it needs clothing, and it needs a set, and it needs chairs, and the crew needs coffee. There's real costs. If you are a junior producer, don't fall into that trap. You are working hard. You deserve to get paid. What you need to do is learn how to carve out your own fee and to carve out that contingency and keep them. hold on to them and realize that those are real constraints, and then manage scope creep to stay inside what's left. So at the end of the day, if you're a junior producer and you make a show and you are able to pay yourself $5,000, high fives all around. You deserve to that money, and you should have made sure to hold on to it. This is just something that so
Totally.
many producers are so apt to get rid of. Is I'll pay my fee because this has to happen. I need to write a check for this.
And I'm going to jump on this just quickly
Yeah.
with something I learned. My show came in a little under budget,
Mm.
but speaking to I've spoke to a television producer who has a lot of experience, and in our system here in Canada, she described it as you gotta have your foot on the gas and then the brake and the gas and the brake, because you need to spend what they give you,
Yes.
but you also don't want to be putting your own money into it. So it's that very fine balance.
Yeah. And on Deep Six and so many projects I've seen, we had the gas pedal strapped down to the floor, and you got to cut that. You got to be, and it's not only and okay. So now I want to talk a little bit about money, because I think this is the kind of show where I can actually get into details that maybe the average person doesn't care about, but a producer might find really important
Yeah,
to talk about or hear about.
absolutely.
Um, without naming names, because I'm going to get into that territory, uh, we had. Okay, I'll drop some details along the way, but most of these, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, you can ignore it because I'm going to get into the nitty gritty meat of this conversation here in a second. We had tax credits as part of our financing.
Yeah.
That just means that we had a chunk of money to make the show that was going to show up down the road, maybe a year or two down the road. It's something that you can do in Canada. You can make a show and you can apply to the government to get some small kickback to help. So we had that in our financing. We had a few other things in there that kind of amounted to about 70,000. So of this 440, about 70 was going to come down the road. Well, I needed to get that $70,000 to pay people for making the show. So what do? Well, you can try and go to a bank. It's tough. It's not quite enough for them to get interested. There's a few private funds, but even they're hard to get a hold of. What do? Well, in my case, I had someone who came on board on the project and wrote me an agreement to loan me the 70,000, and in return, they got some rights. You can think of it as like an executive producer type, right, or they got, if we were ever going to adapt it for television, they got rights if we moved it forward to TV. So it was basically they gave me a loan and they got some involvement in the show. Lo and behold, we wrap cameras and uh, the loan doesn't come through. And all of a sudden, I have a crew and coffees that have been bought and warehouses that have been rented and clothing that has been rented, and I'm short 70,000. What do you do? What do you do if at the end of the day you are suddenly nearly six figures short of what you need to pay people? So this is why the shoot was hard enough. This part ground me as a producer. It ground me down into the ground for about a year and a half following. I maxed out a credit card. I took out a loan. I got a line of credit, and I paid as much as I possibly could, and I was still short about 30,000. So I spent a year owing crew who had worked for me $30,000. This is why I talk about don't just hold back money for yourself to pay you in the end of the day. Hold back money because you owe people a promise that when they're working for you, you're going to deliver. And one of the best ways to thank them is to pay them on time.
Yeah.
It's not a
And
bad way to thank somebody.
I just want to echo. I had a similar experience um, on my show, and my parents ended up helping me.
Yeah.
But we don't, and we, a lot of people approach producing with how do I get the funding, but we don't hear a lot of conversations about the bridge financing or interim financing,
Right.
however, whatever you want to call that money that you get down the road. And depending on the fund, you get your drawdowns and you get your amounts in 2 or 3 installments. And there's always, especially for an emerging producer, a cash flow problem
Right.
while you've gone to camera, because you're paying, as you say, you're paying out your crew and your
Yeah.
cast, which is huge.
If you're
Um,
learning producing, I mean, there's so many documents and things you need to learn on the fly, and it's so complicated. And one of the things that you might want to ignore is what we call a cash flow, which is basically the budget, but now with a calendar where you talk about how you're going to spend the budget, when money comes in, when money comes out, and hopefully at the bottom it stays positive or zero the whole time. You never dip into the negative. Or if you do, you've got a loan or something lined up like I had. Um, that document's pretty important because that's going to tell you, your financial future of the project. And it's going to tell you whether or not you're going to show up on set with a smile and a few $1,000s in the bank to solve a problem, or if you're just going to be burning out and struggling. So it's a critical document. Honestly, like that was a failing of mine. It's one of the last things that I've become good at is coming up with cash flow strategies. Normally, I
right.
would get the budget done and I'd hand that off to someone else. I'm like, I've done my job. I got the money. Do I really have to
And
do
I
this?
think ultimately we learn more from our mistakes, don't we?
Oh,
But
yeah.
now you're probably the guy for cash flow.
Well, maybe. So, yeah, and okay, so I want to tell you and the listeners, and if any of my crew who are listening and are shaking their head and going like, Davin, why are you talking about this? Here is the number one lesson I learned. You cannot over communicate to your crew about where you are in terms of money. Money doesn't feel like the thing you want to talk about. You want to talk about creatives. Well, this is a creative endeavor that has money behind it. So if you're a good producer, you got to talk about it. You got to have an open line of communication with your crew, and that includes when things go right, and it includes when things go wrong. People should have a sense of when a check is going to arrive in the mail and what are the prerequisites, what are the conditions that where that's going to happen. And I tried and I tried and I tried. I literally, this is going to sound like I'm trying to get myself out of trouble, but I'm not. I'm just giving you a sense of how hard I tried to communicate and yet still fell short. For a while, I'd set up a weekly video message out to my crew where I would film a message about where's that $70,000? Where do I think it's going to come from? When do I think it's going to land? And who's going to get paid first? And I started filming myself talking about this and then just releasing that video out to everyone that I owed money. Not enough. You have to not only just tell people, but be open to criticism, be open to questions, be open to feedback. It's not just a one-way conversation, it's a two-way conversation with everyone who's involved. And these are some of the things that I think I learned from that process that maybe is going to make me more confident to take another budget of that level and run with it. Is that now I know you simply cannot over communicate when it comes to money. Like I said, it's not the thing that gets people excited about this job. And in web series, you're not making a lot of money, you're spending it, so it's kind of like, ugh. But it is how you tell your crew that you love them. It's how you thank them for their work, is you pay them.
And $70,000 in a loan on a $400,000 budget. That's a sizable percentage of that budget. Like it's not quite a
Yes.
quarter, but it's a big percentage of it. And it's interesting to me because I think a lot of first time web series creators are like, oh, I want they want huge budgets. They want $1 million budget, or filmmakers, whatever. But you're on the hook for that. like basically take a quarter of that and be like, you're responsible for this amount.
Yeah.
And when we sign the contracts that are, whatever, 30 pages long, like you're liable. Your
Yeah.
name is on that contract if anything goes wrong. And I think there's value in starting with a smaller budget. Like if your first web series is 100,000 or 50,000, it's going to be way more manageable in a way to learn the
Oh,
ropes.
sure. And don't judge yourself by your budget. Just, don't judge yourself. If you have a smaller budget than someone else, it doesn't make your project less interesting. It doesn't make it less important. And to be honest, it's not necessarily going to mean you're going to get less viewers or less industry recognition. Because going back to the same thing I keep saying over and over, if you look at my portfolio, I never take my own advice. But you have the ability as a web series producer to just knock it out of the park in creative ways that a more traditional television thinker hasn't even thought of. It hasn't crossed their plate. You can film something for $10,000 that is better than my Deep Six show that I did for 440,000. I challenge you. I promise you, you can do that. So get out there and get it done. And if your budget is 20,000, hold 5,000 back just as a safety net. That's actually not greedy. It's smart. And at this point, having now really flunked on it in a big way once, I think it's actually almost negligent if you're not doing that.
Davin, where's the best place for us to find out more information on you and what's next for you online?
Uh, well, I'm on Twitter hardly. I'm on Facebook, which I know is so old school. It's gonna actually, like, the gray in my beard is gonna start showing when I say that I'm on Facebook. But that's where I make announcements about the projects that I'm working on and the next web series that I have that's coming out. So yeah, you can find me, Davin Langell, on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, but there I only post interesting squares that I find when I'm walking around. So that's not going to give you a whole lot of insight into me as a producer.
Well, Davin, this has been a real pleasure, and thank you so much. Thank you for being open about the struggles. We all have them when we're creating any content. I think any honest producer would tell you it means a lot. So we really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and just to keep, pulling the veil back from not only the wonderful things that you're creating, but the troubles that you might find along the way. The more we talk about it, the more someone else can learn and maybe avoid them in the future and have a better shoot. So,
Thanks so much for tuning into Inside the Creator's Mind. I'm your host, Katie Uhlmann, and we hope to see you again soon.